So welcome to the sixth lecture of our series. My name is Natasha Wingreen. I am the Outreach Director at New Haven Reads.
I'm Julie Yerganian. I'm the Outreach Assistant at New Haven Reads.
We are excited that you guys are here today. At New Haven Reads, our mission is to increase the literacy skills of children by providing individually tailored one-on-one after-school tutoring, educational family support, and a community book bank, all at no cost to participants. In addition to our free book bank and one-on-one tutoring program, New Haven Reads offers early readiness classes for pre-K and kindergarten students, as well as resources for teachers. In March, our tutoring program reached over 500 students a week, and we had 375 active volunteer tutors. While our programming has had to adapt in recent months, we continue to support our students and families through online tutoring and book bank distribution sites. Through this lecture series, we are excited to hear from experts likewise invested in promoting literacy and expanding educational access, and to share this experience and knowledge with the wider New Haven community. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture. So there's just a few housekeeping items to help ensure a quality experience for all. Please keep yourself on mute. To see the speaker only, please adjust to the speaker view in the right upper hand corner of your screen. And then following the lecture, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please do so by typing a private message to Julie. She's going to be our questionnaire today, moderator, using the chat function in Zoom. And then Julie will read your question to our guest speaker for a response. So we are so thrilled to introduce Bryan Brown. So Bryan Brown is an Associate Professor of Science Education and former Associate Dean at Stanford University. He holds a BS from Hampton University, a master's degree in educational psychology from the University of California, and a Ph.D. in educational psychology from the University of Santa Barbara. His work focuses on the role of language in science teaching and learning. Dr. Brown studies how race, technology, language, and culture impact science teaching in urban schools. So we are really really thrilled to have Dr. Bryan Brown with us today. Please welcome Bryan Brown.
All right, so I am going to turn my screen share on so I can show you some things, but thank you for having me on a Saturday. I can't imagine this volume of teachers, and people interested in education on Saturday coming together to talk. So I truly appreciate having you all here. So I'm going to just start by telling you what I hope to accomplish today. And it's pretty straightforward. I want to give you kind of the snapshot, the big ideas of my book, Science in the City, in about 20 minutes. There used to be things called Cliff Notes that I don't think live today anymore, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of the book. And I hope to be both theoretical and pragmatic, meaning I have some ideas that I hope will help you as educators. And I want to see if we can work that out today. So let me start by saying this. There's something very unique about science teaching that is the subtext of what we're going to talk about. It's super important. You never hear historians say, well, you're just not smart enough to be a historian. You didn't do well in intro world civilizations. Therefore, I don't think this history thing is going to work out for you. We have reader classes for historians, or for English classes. We don't hear people say, well, we need to produce the next generation of journalists, and we don't think you're smart enough because you didn't really do well in first grade, in ninth grade English. Well, in science, it is normal for people to say, you're just not smart enough to be a scientist, or you struggle in introductory biology. And the assumption is not that it was taught poorly, but that you're just not capable because science is for the academically elite. And so that culture enables us to hide behind poor instruction. So here's what I want to do today. Share some basic ideas about the book, discuss teaching practices that you can use that are based on research, and then make sure we have lots of time for conversation. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is this idea called the black tax. And so I wish I could hear you talk to me right now, because here's a question. First question I might ask is, who's on the screen right now? And I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure if you can see it, but on the screen here is an individual named James Meredith. And where James Meredith is headed is to register for his first day of class. And the motivation for my book was rooted in this thing that happened in 1965. And so he's headed to register for the University of Mississippi. And I started to imagine this notion of the black tax. And so the black tax is something in the African-American community. My grandmother, my parents told me, that fair is a four-letter word, that things are not fair in this country. And because of this inherent inequality that's a part of the culture, there's going to be additional burdens on you. Right? You just need to make sure that you do the best that you can and make sure that you fight through these other things, this additional burden, also known as the black tax. And so here's my imagination. He registers, but look at the faces of the people behind him. These are the National Guardsmen whose job is to protect him. No one is happy here. You have protesters behind him. Everybody is angry. This is just day one of college. And so I started to imagine, what does day two look like? What did day 5 look like? What did week 3 in the semester look like for James Meredith? When he's in class and the teacher is asking for assignments, what kind of additional tax did he have to pay? And so the good news is somehow he was able to fight through it. He graduated from the University of Mississippi, he even got a Ph.D. And so there's something just really amazing about this additional tax that he had to go through. And so the question is, what does 1965 have to do with what's happening in modern schools? And so I want to argue today, there is an additional black tax that happens, and I use it broadly to refer to language in general, that happens around what linguists call linguistic racism. I'm going to call it linguistic bias, is that we expect people to communicate in ways we don't express it, we don't clearly express. There's a general bias that exists in US schools and classrooms about how kids should sound, what things they should say. So here, think about it this way. You go to chemistry class, and the one thing that you should not know in chemistry class is chemistry, because that's why you're in chemistry class. And then the teacher proceeds to ask you a whole bunch of questions about, you guessed it, chemistry, the one thing that you do not know. And they want you to use science language to communicate those ideas. And so part of what's happening is we have a false expectation about how language should be happening in classrooms, right? And so let me give you a quick example of how this plays out. So I'm going to take you to it's a football game. It's maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, the championship game for the university. I think this is Florida State University. The quarterback throws a touchdown, and then he's interviewed. So pay close attention to this interview.
15 to go in this game. Final drive. What did you tell your teammates around it?
I said, guys, we didn't come here for no reason. I said, guys, this is ours, man. This is all the adversity we went through. The first few quarters, it was ours to take. And like I just said, we control our own destiny. Those men looked me in my eye and they said, we got this, James. And I said, are you strong? They said, I'm strong if you strong. I said, we strong in here.
After struggling through the first half, what was the biggest adjustment you guys made at halftime?
We had to go back to playing Florida State football. We came out here, we were letting us be bigger than the game. We were bigger than the game. Then we had to say, hey, let's play Florida State football, because can't nobody be bigger than this game. And we did that, and we came out victorious.
You had an embrace with your head coach, Jim Ball Fisher. You've been through a lot with him this season. What did you guys share in that moment, James?
We champions. We can say that we are champions together.
Okay. And so moments after this, a post from Dee Dee McCarron, she says, am I listening to English? And so who Dee Dee McCarron is important. She is a mother. She's a mother of A.J. McCarron, who was the quarterback of the University of Alabama, who'd won the national championship just years ago. And also that enables me to use Twitter for research purposes, which I truly enjoy. And so on January 7th, 12:09 a.m., she responds by saying, am I listening to English, right? Something must have happened, because moments later, 1:39 a.m., she says, anyone that knows our family knows that we're far from racist. My tweet was not in any way meant that way. I sincerely apologize if I offended anyone. And I'm not here to disparage Dee Dee McCarron. What I wanted to suggest to you is that what she heard did not meet her expectations, right? She was expecting something different. Reggie Bush says this. He says, love listening to this dude, Jameis Winston, talk after games. He walks and talks like a true champion, a great role model for kids to look up to. Now, he got into some trouble, so I don't know about the role model thing, but here's the thing. How could two people hear the exact same thing and emerge with such varied perspectives, right? Their expectations were very different. Let me give you another example, right? Same day, 12:10 a.m. LeBron James, I'm not sure who LeBron James is, but he says this, Unfreaking believable interview by Jameis. It just shows part of the reason why he's so special. And so here you have celebrities commenting, how could you possibly hear the same thing and respond so differently? And so I'd like to argue that the expectation was unrealistic. And so there's a word that I hate in the US in English, and it's organic. As a scientist, what organic means is it's made of a carbon-based structure, so everything is organic, right? But when we talk about organic, we mean left alone, undefined. And so I want to argue today that one of the big problems with schools is organic language norms. So here's the question. What did Didi McCarron expect him to say? He's excited, he's 19 years old, he throws a touchdown, the biggest day of his life. Seconds later, microphone's in his face. Here's what maybe she wanted him to say. So James, tell you how did you feel? Well, it was a fascinating competition. At some point, my teammates and I were overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. We lost our focus. It doesn't even sound right, right? It is a news broadcaster voice, which is not even an authentic voice, right? He sounded like a 19-year-old African-American from Mobile, Alabama, who's speaking specifically to a group of mostly African-American 20-somethings from the South. The way that he spoke matched the environment. But here's the question. Did the expectation for how he should speak match the authentic environment? Why would he sound like a news broadcaster? So I want to argue that is a modern day black tax, right? This linguistic norm, how we expect students to sound, right? So we allow the norms of language to be left undefined. So for example, Ferris Bueller, go watch that movie. I've been watching everything. Go watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off again. It is the perfect educational film. There's a point where Ben Stein is lecturing. He asked maybe 11 or 12 questions, and he asks the questions and answers the questions for himself. We have a organic norm in language in classrooms, right? We expect students to have the right answers when our job is to teach them. More importantly, we expect them to communicate in the language that we're teaching them at the same time, when the things that they learn are probably not learned in the language of the classroom. So part of the problem is we allow the culture of power to define the culture of the language, the culture of the learning environment. And I want to suggest to you, if you really want kids to learn, we have to start by where they are, and then we explicitly teach them the language of the classroom. So we just read chapters 1 through 3 in my book. There we go. We just did it, right? We explored how language serves as a big hurdle, how science is really the gatekeeper, because science in some cases has more new words in an introductory science class than you might have in a Spanish class. But in a foreign language class, at least the teacher is wise enough to say the way that you'll master language is to speak it poorly. The more you use Spanish and it's wrong, I can correct you, but I'll get you to mastery by practicing it. When you're in a science classroom, here's what happens. You often do not use the science language until the test. And it is in those moments when you realize, I thought I understood what that meant. I'm here to tell you that part of what we need to do is shift our focus to allowing students to practice science language earlier, and that is how they'll master both the ideas and the language of science. So let me give you the framework that we've developed over about 10 years. Is called the language identity dilemma. And there's two components. The first is cognitive. If I communicate in complicated science language, and you've all had this experience, you've been in a science classroom and the teacher is saying, well, inside of the nucleolus, the nucleus is a nucleolus, and the nucleolus is responsible for ribosomes, and ribosomes produce protein. And you're like, I have no idea what you just said. There's a failure to be understood if we communicate with dense language so that we're not taking care that the ideas are clear. The second, students might have the right answers, but they might be communicating in a everyday vernacular language. So when a student is communicating, can you hear their brilliance, or are you looking for the right ideas in the right language? The second is emotional. I'm frustrated because this jargon is telling me I'm not supposed to be here. And finally, I don't speak like this. Maybe the science thing is not for me. So the #1 show for many years, I forget the name of it. CBS has this show about these scientists, and the whole point of their existence is that they're so socially awkward that they can't exist in the world, right? That does the exact opposite of what we want to do. We want to let everybody know that not only can you be a scientist, but we need you to be deeply involved in the scientific community, right? So there's an emotional subtext where people feel uncomfortable because the language of science is intimidating. So let me give you a quick example. So many years ago, we did a study of how curveballs are thrown and whether or not students had a rich understanding of the physics of curveballs. And so if the ball is moving across the screen, there's a spin to the baseball. And so at the top of the ball, the air, because the ball is traveling this way, the air is going against the seam. So as you spin, the air is pushing the opposite direction of the seams. But on the bottom, because the ball is spinning, the airflow is in the same direction of the seams. And so this is important. That means there's greater air pressure on the top of the ball than on the bottom of the ball. So if you spin it really hard, it causes the baseball to fall quickly. And this is called the Magnus effect or differential air pressure. It's the same phenomena that we use to lift airplanes off the ground. It's the same reason why we have spoilers on the back of cars, is because if we change the air resistance, we can push things up or keep them down. And so I asked these young people a simple question. Tell me how a curveball curves, right? Take a listen.
Well, when you flick the ball, it cuts through the air. It has different airs under it and over it, and starts pressing it down, so it drops, and the air on the bottom is more loose in the high way, and it just, like, the heavy pressure makes it drop.
So I wish we could have a conversation right now, because I asked you a very simple question. Is he right or is he wrong? He never said air pressure differential. He never said Magnus effect, right? He says there's different airs on top and the bottom of the ball. If he means that there's carbon dioxide and nitrogen and sulfur on the top, and there is mercury and oxygen on the bottom, then he's wrong. But if he means that the air is pushing differently on top of the ball, he's absolutely right. And so if we separate concepts from language, what we can see is a young person who has a depth of understanding about how curveballs curve. But will you as a teacher say, that is a brilliant answer? Now, when you say air on top and the bottom of the ball, scientists say air pressure differential. Now we're adding language to idea, right? Often this becomes invisible to teachers. We're listening for terms. And so this brilliant young person doesn't see themselves as having the foundational understanding that is a part of physics, right? So what do we do with that? Right? Part of what we do in the teacher education program here is teach our teachers to break this binary understanding, that understanding the word and understanding the language are the same thing. In fact, ask your students this very simple question. What do you mean? When they use science language, and you'll find either a depth of understanding, or you'll create the point where the students will have to go, okay, let me get some clarity because I'm not sure what that word means. All right, so I'm not just a theorist. I have a burden of responsibility as a scholar. And so I spent about 5 years studying this as a phenomena. So what if we did something differently? What if we started by teaching with very simple language and saying, let's teach the idea first, and then let's ask the students to practice the science language, right? That's the second part. And then third, we just give them lots of opportunities to use the science language. We call that just aggregate instruction. And so if I start by idea first, and then ask them to use the science language, would students learn better? And so we train teachers to do that in our teacher education program. And I want to give you an excerpt of how this happens. And so we also teach them that if you're going to forget everything that you don't practice every day. So what if we teach them a phenomena in the context of something that they're familiar with and allow them to understand the idea first? So listen to the story of osmosis as explained in the context of Finding Nemo. Pay close attention to the language of science, because this is what we call this aggregate instruction.
Now, we all know and love the story of Finding Nemo. Father and son get separated. Son makes new friends in a fish tank. Father goes on an epic journey to save his only child. And following the Disney way of life, everyone ends up living happily ever after. But what if there was some dark twist lurking in the shadow of the story? What if the dentist who found our tiny orange friend actually gave Nemo to his crazy niece Darla? She doesn't know about marine life, and instead of putting Nemo into a new and friendly saltwater fish tank, she put Nemo into a freshwater fish bowl. Would it really matter? Saltwater, freshwater, I mean, it's all water, right? Would everything end up happily ever after for our little lost clownfish Nemo? No, no way. So what gives? Why can't you put a saltwater fish into a freshwater tank? Well, fish that live in the ocean, like our little friend Nemo, are happy campers when they're surrounded by water. There's salt inside Nemo's body and outside Nemo's body. Nature likes everything to be balanced. And this is exactly what happens for saltwater fish when they're in a saltwater environment. Because again, there's salt on both sides of Nemo's skin. But when you put a fish like Nemo into freshwater, the conditions around him change. Now, unlike his happy home in the ocean, Nemo has more salt in his body than the freshwater around him. Nature hates that there's more salt on the inside than on the outside and wants to balance this out. Now, if we could look through a microscope at Nemo's body, we would see that there's tiny openings in his skin, kind of like doorways. Now, the salt molecules inside Nemo's body are way too big to fit through these tiny doorways. But water molecules are super small and fit perfectly through them. Only water can move easily in and out of a fish's body. Nature wants everything to even out, and the only way you can balance this is for water to start pouring into Nemo's body. Well, Nemo has so much salt compared to the fresh water surrounding him that the water just keeps coming in his body. With this effect, Nemo may as well have been a blowfish instead of a clownfish because he will swell up like a balloon. Eventually, he'll swell up so much that his cells will start to burst until finally he goes belly up. Poor Nemo. Doesn't really make for a very good Disney ending. This process of water flowing through these tiny doorways is called osmosis, and it's an amazing phenomenon. Don't put Nemo into a freshwater tank. He's a saltwater fish and needs to be surrounded by salt. The most important tip for our fishy friends out there: stay on osmosis's good side.
All right, so there's an example of how a language first approach, where you focus on the ideas first, add language second, helps maintain clarity. The second principle that we focus on is what's called the generativity principle. And here's the idea. There was a time when you remembered everyone's phone number. I could ask you what your best friend's phone number is, and I can almost guarantee you maybe you have a sibling's number remembered or a parent, but you've deleted every phone number in this computer on your shoulders. And there's a reason. The moment the smartphone enabled you to not need that information, it becomes unnecessary, it is deleted. So the argument for us is if you're going to delete all unnecessary information, that it's important that you teach science in the context of things that the kids can see, because you cannot forget applicable information, right? So we're asking teachers to learn how to teach how learning works. So learning happens because of necessity, right? And so teaching has to happen in situations where students cannot forget the content. So let me give you an example. We just talked about osmosis. So I might teach osmosis in the context of marinating chicken or marinating food or marinating whatever. The reason why is if I tell you the story of how water is traveling back and forth across the membrane of the skin of the chicken, and that the tiny spaces in between the membrane enable the seasoning to come in and out, what you're doing is that you're ensuring every time that young person sees marinating food again, it triggers the memory to think about osmosis, or why we spray the vegetables at the grocery store. That is the story of osmosis. And so what we're teaching is separate the language first, teach science in the context of students, things that they see every day, and it produces greater understanding. And so in our 10 years of research, what we found is time and time again, experiment after experiment, students retain information at much higher rates if you use simple language and if you ask them to apply it to things that they see every day. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I want to talk to you about some of the things we've been doing now to press forward, right? The future of research. So the first thing is we've been thinking about how technology plays a role in teaching and learning. So in California, we're in one of the most diverse environments ever. It will take years to diversify our teaching force, but our digital curriculum can be diverse today. So one of the things we did was an experiment with digital books, iBooks, and we did two groups. One group we had racial matching. So if you were a young woman who wore a hijab, we found a person who looked like you to be your teacher. The other group got a racially generic, meaning who's the person that they're more likely to see as a teacher, which is white and female. And so what we found was that students developed a deeper connection to the discipline by being able to see someone that looks like themselves in the instruction. And so it's just a subtle tweak of, you can grab videos offline, you can diversify your classroom today by thinking about how the images that the students see send them a message of belonging. I'll give you another example. We've been using virtual reality as a way to take students into their community to see how science is happening. And again, it goes back to this idea of generativity. If I teach you about the science of food health, but I show you how there are very few food options in your community and how it's affecting you, then every time you drive through the community, we're triggering that memory and making it very difficult for students to forget the science. So let me give you a quick excerpt of what that looks like. So you see in the virtual environment, the question for the students is, how many fast food restaurants do you see? This is a lesson about food chains. So we're asking them to think critically about how food options impact community health. So then we take them into the local convenience store. This is actually a store right next to the schools where we did this study. And they're looking for fresh fruits and vegetables, right? After identifying how many fast food restaurants in their neighborhood, we asked them to do an analysis of the food health options in their local context. Okay. And finally, we overlay a map of the local dialysis centers that are popping up in their neighborhood, so they can make a connection between lack of access to healthy food and the diabetes centers that are being placed in their local community. And so for the sake of time, here's the message, is we really have a new opportunity here that the technology can provide students with both diverse representation and enable them to do really rich analysis of, here's how science matters for me. And so our new work focuses on smartphone enhanced science teaching, where we're using smartphones as learning devices. It's just part of the book at the end, that technology can be a cultural bridge. And so in your classrooms, if you want them to know that female chemists are out there doing important work, you don't have to get them to come into your classroom. Incorporate them through videos, to Zoom lectures. Bring those people to your classroom and make sure you're using technology as a cultural bridge, right? And finally, here's the good news. You don't have to be a cultural expert. You don't need to be a digital expert. The students are phenomenal at producing technology. Let them do it for you, as opposed to you trying to build all the resources. Have students create video opportunities for you to incorporate into your instruction. So the message of the book is very, very simple. The first is that let's rethink how language shapes classrooms, right? Be really explicit about how what we want to do is enable everybody to talk towards expertise, that all answers are valuable because kids know things and know things in great depth. Let's recognize that and teach them the language of science. The best way to do it is to give them lots of opportunities to talk about science phenomena and make sure they're practicing using science language. And finally, use technology to bring people into your classrooms. Use it to diversify across every possible venue. Take the burden off yourself and let the kids create that technology, and you'll see that you'll be able to build some cultural bridges. And so I want you to make a promise to me that this is the first of many conversations we'll have about language, cognition, and science teaching. We're trying to do some things. The first is we have a web-based app, scienceinthecity.stanford.edu. Feel free to download resources. They're there for you to use and try. If you want to share resources, share them with us. We'd love to post really intriguing science lessons for students of all ages. And you know, I'm active on Twitter these days because I have to be. So if you want to continue the conversation, let's do that there. You just read Science in the City, and I look forward to your questions and answers. Thank you for having me today.
Great. Thank you, Bryan Brown. We do have a few questions that have come in. So someone asks, I'm a science teacher in New Haven, and I'm concerned that the tests used to assess the brilliance of our youth do not accurately measure what they know or can do. I'm curious if Dr. Brown has ideas for how we improve assessment.
So there's a whole group of people right now focusing on performance assessment. That is the move forward. That if you really want to know whether or not students understand, have them do something to demonstrate. The problem right now is that they're not able to digitally score those things. So they're working on all of these algorithms to pull that off. And so I've seen versions of them and they're not that accurate, but the key is performance, right, at this point. So I guess there's two components. The first component is until they change your assessment, you need to make sure your kids can perform well on the assessment. And so here's my attitude. If you know it and know it in depth, your kids they'll do great. Right? It's only that they don't know the concepts in depth that they struggle. And so let's make sure that we do that until the assessment changes. I'm in support of performance-based assessment because that is, to me, the most authentic way to test whether or not the kids know things.
Thank you. And we do have a lot of great comments coming in too. It says two of my daughters are involved in science teaching, and I cannot wait to share your ideas with them. Could you say the web address one more time, actually?
scienceinthecity.stanford.edu.
Great, thank you. Okay, one more question. Is the goal of literacy education to connect students to the normative language and dominant syntax, or is part of the goal to diversify the normative language itself?
Wow, I took so many classes on this that I'm trying to make this not so academic. I have two goals. The first is mastery. So let's master the discourse. So I can master the language and literacy practices that the world uses, whether that is I understand how science articles are written. I can understand how textbooks are written. I understand. The second is I'm empowered to recognize and critique it. So if I read an article, and I know that, for example, there's an article that came out a few days ago about how, excuse me, of how cholesterol levels for those who eat meat that is produced from plants are lower than beef. So people have better heart health if you eat plant-based meat, all right? But who paid for the study? The company that paid for the study was the company that makes the plant-based meat, right? And so I need you to have the literacy skills to understand, but also critique so that you can change the world and you're not victim to poor interpretation. I need you to be able to look at COVID data and analyze it and understand what it means and why certain people are impacted in different ways, to really have a depth of knowledge. So my argument is that literacy has two phases. The first is, can I master it? The second, I need to have a mastery of it that is so empowering that I can critique who's doing it, how it works, and I'm not a victim to anybody's interpretation.
Thank you. Another question, how receptive have teachers been to this new method?
Teachers often go, duh. I get the duh response. Like, obviously, yeah, this is what I've been doing. I just didn't have the word for it, or I have not had the specific studies to prove it, or I don't do it all the time. And so it's intuitive. Right. And so for example, one of the things that I've seen teachers do is word walls or root word meanings. Right. So any word that ends in ASE, it's an enzyme. And what you're trying to do is help. And I would argue that's not how language works. Language works by using it and using it again. And so they've been trying to do things, and I'm generally giving them more specific approaches, and they're always very open to it. So teachers, I think in general, have been very affirming and supportive because I'm labeling the things that many have been trying to put a finger on for years.
So one more, if you could speak to the importance of access to hands-on and exploratory learning in internalizing scientific language and concepts.
Great question. So I'm biased towards science teaching. I feel like we have the best opportunities in the world because we're not just talking about things, we're doing things. As a young teacher, I was heavily focused on experimentation, but I didn't give the students enough opportunities to apply what they've learned. And so they didn't perform well on assessments. And I had to look back and say, well, why is it that the kids don't appear to know? Because what I was teaching them to do was labs. They were great at doing lab work. And so you have to experience the phenomena, But you also have to have lots of opportunities to build models, to explain using data, to explain the ideas. And so you have to pair experience with explanation. That's what science is. People think of science as purely laboratory based. Albert Einstein was a theoretical physicist, right? There weren't labs that were happening. Gregor Mendel did one experiment, but most of his work was theoretical. All right, we need to rethink science as multidisciplinary, right? It is experiential, but it's also very much model building and explanatory. So the answer is do lots of labs, but make sure every kid has an opportunity to explain and apply the language, because that's when mastery happens.
Great. We do have a couple more. What techniques do you use to create opportunities to practice scientific language separate from learning the concepts?
Good. So very simple. We have this thing called generative formative assessment. So when you think of formative assessment, I'm not talking about thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways, how are you doing? I'm saying in your lesson, ask them to explain the concept. So for example, if we do the first part of our lab and we're talking about osmosis and we're talking about water movement, stop and have a short write-up, okay? I want you to explain how this applies to how marinating chicken. And then in parentheses, I'm adding actual word practice. In your explanation, use words like semi-permeable membrane and random kinetic energy. We want them to practice the words. Now, one or two things will happen. Either they'll go, wait, what is random kinetic energy? Perfect. Now I know that you didn't understand it, and if you get proper opportunity to explain it, that's how you come to master it, right? Or they'll gain great confidence. They'll be able to explain it and say, I've got it. Or they'll get a partial understanding. They'll say, well, I thought I understood it, but this part isn't clear and this part is unclear. It's fruitful for you and it's fruitful for them. So I'm saying use your formative assessments in a more structured way. Ask them to explain the concepts, and along the way, ask them to use the science language in those explanations.
Great. Okay, we've got two more. How can we alter people's expectations of each other's language and way of speaking? How can we be more open to and appreciative of varied modes of self-expression without judgment?
So I think that's a great question. I would start by making sure we have an explicit conversation about language in the first place. So for example, I've never been to New Haven, right? I don't know the New Haven accent, but I'm sure there is a New Haven accent. My question would be, do the news broadcasters sound like people from New Haven, or do they sound like some generic middle of nowhere way of communicating? In California, I can tell you for sure that the news broadcasters here do not sound like Californians. They don't speak with a California accent. So part of what's important is establishing a linguistic norm in the classroom. So for example, I want everybody to be able to explain science ideas, right? In order for me to do that, I'm going to ask you to explain lots of things, and I'll ask you to practice the science language, right? I'm going to make sure that when we start instruction, I'm going to use very simple language so that you understand the ideas. If you don't understand the ideas, if you don't understand the science language, I need there to be transparency. So setting up a language learning norm, we don't need to think about it in an abstract way. Just figure out, what do the Spanish teachers do? So in my classroom, Spanish teachers would say, okay, Tuesdays and Thursdays, it is Spanish only. And I would be like, oh no, I can't take it because I don't speak Spanish. And the Spanish teacher knew that. So they allowed me to speak broken Spanish towards some level of fluency. I'm arguing to adopt those same practices, right? Make sure the kids have lots of opportunities, that there's a clear norm. Otherwise, we deal with this organic norm where no one really knows why we're doing what we're doing. So for example, why do we raise our hands to speak in a classroom? Who set that up? Whose rule is that? And why do we all use it? Does it work? I'm kind of going tangential, but I got to go there. We say that a well-ordered classroom is a quiet classroom. The teacher is speaking, right? So in the chat, if the speaker is teaching, someone tell me who's learning. Can I get at least one chat answer, please? Talk to me.
The teacher.
Thank you.
And we also have some people saying nobody.
Exactly. So classrooms should be places where kids are constantly talking. For management's sake, we can write it down. Now, this is one of the benefits of the digital space. We use a platform called Nearpod or Poll Everywhere. If you make the comments anonymous, you can get 35 kids explaining right now, right? And explanation produces understanding. If you want to read about it, check out the research of Mickey Chi or Michelin Chi at Arizona State University. 20 years of research that prove that those who explain develop a much deeper understanding, right? So classrooms should be places where kids get to offer the wrong answer over and over again, because that'll lead them to the correct answer.
Great. So we do have 2 questions left if you want to hang around and answer, or I can send them to you and they can be responded to over email.
I can do 2. I can
Great.
do 2.
Okay. And then after that, we can send you in an email. How can this method of learning lead to having more children of color interested in science as a profession or career?
So I don't want to go that far, because I would be making a claim that I can't prove. But going back to my initial point, I'm a science teacher. I feel like I've never come across a kid I can't convince to love science. It's just better than every other discipline. I'm sorry, those of you who are not science teachers. We have a great time. It is awesome, right? The burden is this lie that only the most intellectually elite can participate in science. The images that they see that tell them I should not participate in science. And so when you teach in a way that teaches them about phenomena in their own lives, it's almost impossible to convince a kid that you can't be a scientist, because everything that I've taught you is about how important science is to the neighborhood, the block, the family that you belong to. And so that's a part of the book, is making sure that the value of science is explicitly clear. And just because I have the burden of proof as a researcher, in every research study that we've done for the last 5 years, we've proven that taking these culturally relevant approaches has its biggest impact in shifting students' attitudes towards science. Particularly those who have negative attitudes towards science, they almost uniformly end up having positive attitudes about science and scientific careers, simply by teaching in a way that shows that phenomena matters to their local neighborhoods.
Great. Okay, last one. Are you familiar with Tony Jack's work? One idea is that the language of higher ed, such as office hours, makes it inherently inaccessible.
I'm not.
If you're familiar with his work or want to speak to that idea at all.
I don't know. I mean, I would only be speaking of the N of one. When I went to school, I didn't know enough to go to office hours. That required knowing something, and I was not there. So I don't know.
All right. Great. Well, thank you so much for sticking around to get through all those questions and for your lecture. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today on a Saturday.
So I just want to reiterate what Julie just said. Thank you so much, Bryan Brown, for your time. It was fascinating. I think the conversation was wonderful, getting us to think a little bit outside of our box and maybe our norms. We put this lecture up on our website. You can find all of our past lectures on our website as well. And we'll be sending you guys a link to this lecture, a YouTube link. And just want to say thank you guys for coming on a Saturday to sort of just come together as a community, and just reiterate that thank you for your time, Bryan Brown. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. You all have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, enjoy your Saturday, everybody. Thank you so much.